This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective. Welcome back, everyone, to the International Socialist Alternative broadcast of World to Win. This is part 2 of our end of the year special. We have a couple of exciting features at the end. We're going to count down our top 5 biggest fans. So make sure you stay tuned to see if you made that list. And also, of course, our shout out. So let's get started. And I want to say hi to my co-host, Yara.
How are you doing?
How's it going? Good to see you.
Very good. I'm very excited about this episode. I mean, talking about all of the things that we maybe have left out last time.
Let's get started.
Another thing that's been kind of the highlight of the previous few years was the climate. We saw kind of hugely inspiring climate strikes at the end of last year around the world. And we've seen school students in particular that kind of were radicalized by the question of the climate, which is completely understandable when you think about, thinking about being stuck at school all the time, not knowing if you'll ever use the knowledge that you have and that you've learned. And we kind of learn more and more about the horrible and catastrophic effects that the climate crisis has. But we've also had the pandemic that kind of pushed those movements to the side a bit. But during 2020, we've seen so much of the effect of the climate, again, adding to the long list of crises that we've seen. And I think people are seeing even more than in 2019 how it's not enough to reform. We need a much more radical change because the system is the problem here. And I think it will be really, really interesting to look at this from the perspective of 2020 and obviously maybe at the end kind of try and think of what's going to happen next. So we have Rebecca from our US organization. Hi, Rebecca. And we also have Bill from the Canadian section of the International Socialist Alternative. How are you doing, Bill? So I'm really excited to discuss this. And I think, we all know that the climate crisis is one of the most severe crises that we have. And in fact, we entered 2020 with the world in flames. I don't know if our viewers remember, but we started it with the bushfires in Australia. And that was devastating. And it looked like it's going to be something that is just intensifying year by year. And then we also started seeing that happening in other places around the world. So I was wondering if we could kind of go back to that. And so, Bill, do you think it's fair to say that the fires were caused by climate change? And how do we get to the stage where this is happening all the time?
It's important just to remind ourselves about 2019. For instance, here in Canada, 1 million, mainly young people, marched on September 2019 around climate change. And obviously, as you said, COVID pushed it back. But it's merely pressure cooked that anger and it will return. But yeah, behind COVID, 2020 was a year of fire, starting in Australia, but it spread to Siberia, crazy fires in Siberia, in California down the coast from where I am. And probably the most alarming to me is the wetlands of the Amazon are burning. And that's really weird when wetlands start burning. Now, you could say an individual fire may or may not be caused by climate change, but a world situation of fire. And on top of that, you have storms, floods, melting Arctic, collapsing coral reefs. All that is due to climate change. Climate change means hotter and longer summers, changing rainfall patterns, both of which drive fires. Warmer oceans that are more acidic cause all sorts of other issues that we're suffering from. All this is due to climate change. And the politicians knew this, been warning for years that this is coming. What did? They went to fancy conferences and talked, but did nothing. And big business lied and delayed any action. And really, COVID's been a disaster, but behind it is even worse in terms of climate change. And Australia gives us a picture of the future, but the future is now. There were 15,000 fires across every state of Australia. It burned 186,000 square kilometers. To give an idea, that's twice the size of Portugal. It killed at least 3 billion animals, the fires in Australia. Now, it's true fire is part of natural ecosystems, but capitalism causes the climate change and even makes the fires worse. Because on top of climate change, forest mismanagement, what they do call fire suppression. And if you suppress something, it doesn't go away. It just stores up and comes back even more powerful in the future. And they also cut fire services. In Australia, most of the firefighters are volunteers, and much of the firefighting service is actually funded by donations. So on top of climate, everything else makes it worse. But even in parts of Siberia and Canada, where there aren't any human mismanagement, the fires have been catastrophic. But I think we need to be clear. To be really accurate, fires were not caused by the disastrous fires we've seen in the last few years were not caused by climate change. Behind that lies capitalism. Capitalism is the root cause of the crisis of forestry and of fires.
Yes, I think this is a really significant point, because climate change on its own happened because of capitalism, and it can be this. So we still have time to sort it as much as we can after so long, but it's just not in the interest of capitalism to do that. And I think the point that you made at the start there of, one fire might not be due to climate change, but so many fires all around the world is a very significant one. And especially when you add all of the rest of the issues that we've seen in the last few decades and in this year in a very intense way. And I think one of the most memorable ones is in the middle of the pandemic, where we had the devastating wildfires in California. And I know this is a particularly personal issue for you, Rebecca, because I know you grew up there. And I think our viewers definitely would probably remember the photos and videos that showed the smoke and the darkness all around, which had kind of a real apocalyptic feeling to it. And in the long term, we can also say that it's climate change, but like Bill was saying before, it's also about the way to manage it, because this is not the first year that's been happening in California. This is something that's ongoing. It's fire season. So the budgets are important. The way the capitalism is dealing with it is important. So Rebecca, can you explain a little bit why we're saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Yara. Like you said, I grew up in the Bay Area, so this is definitely a personal one for me. I remember waking up to photos from my family of these crazy orange skies like I had never seen in the 18 years that I lived there. I have a family friend who lost his home in the Paradise wildfires that happened 2 years ago in 2018. So yeah, this is definitely not new, but it's not just climate change, like y'all have been saying. It's also the underfunding of forest management and fire management services, but it's also just taking an incorrect approach to forest management. I think Bill was starting to get at this, but in prehistoric times, 4 to 12 million acres would burn in California every single year. That's natural. That's normal. It's actually really important for the ecosystems that live there. But for many decades in California, the approach has been, if it burns, put it out, right? Which has meant that a lot of the debris that normally every year would be burned away has actually built up. And so when you do see these fires, they just rage out of control. In places like the Southeast and in many indigenous cultures for hundreds of years, there's been the practice of controlled burning, which, really helps, but the state has totally refused to take up. And so you see that their approach just is not working. The budget devoted explicitly to fighting fires, in the California Forest Service has increased from 15 to 55% in recent years, right? They're having to respond more to the fires that are getting worse. And because all the money is coming from the same diminishing pot, that means they have less money to prevent the fires, which means they're spending more time fighting the fires, And not only that, but you see cut after cut to the firefighting service. In May, the California Fire Department requested funding to hire an additional 500 firefighters. So this is a few months before the fire season is coming. It's at the same time every year. We know that. Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom only gave them money for 167. And when the fires broke out, even if you'd given the full 500, that simply would not have been enough. And so you saw that literally in the peak of this crisis, firefighters were working for days straight with a 7.5% pay cut that the governor also implemented in July, with no sleep, risking their lives, often in many cases fighting to save their own homes and communities, right? And the state has also historically relied on prison labor to fight fires. So you have incarcerated individuals who, under the racist US incarceration system, are more likely to be Black and brown, doing this insanely dangerous work. But because of COVID outbreaks in prison across the country, many prisoners have, being released early, you then also had prison labor shortages. And so you saw the state reaching out to like literally Australia and other countries to send reinforcements in real time as people were losing their entire homes and communities and everything they'd ever known. And the governor, in the midst of all of this, tweeted saying, like, climate change is real. And it's like, cool, dude. Why then did you literally approve 36 new fracking permits since COVID began? Why have you strangled funding to fight fires for years when scientists from the 1980s could have told you it was not going to be good enough?
Those numbers that Rebecca just mentioned are absolutely insane. And every time I hear about the fact of, incarcerated people being the ones to fight fires for, something piddly like $2 a day, risking their lives, it's devastating when you think about it and what's happening to the environment. I want to shift a little bit from the wildfires to hurricanes. So I wanted to ask Bill, we saw a massive hurricane season like we have over the past few years. Going back to a few years ago, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Harvey in Texas, and now we had Storm Eta wreak havoc throughout Central America. And we need to acknowledge that these countries have an extremely large proportion of people who are already very poor. And so they, when they get hit by a hurricane, they suffer particularly hard. And then on top of that, the effects of the pandemic and the civil unrest that is happening right now in that region of the world. But there are a lot of people, climate change deniers, and I don't want to give them too much time, but there are a lot of people who maybe aren't necessarily climate change deniers, but who say that these are natural disasters that just happen regularly. So I want to ask you, Bill, what do you say to those types of arguments that, these are just regular old natural disasters? But also, if you could explain a little bit how the effects of climate change are exacerbated on places like Central America.
Just one point on the fires. I live 2,000 miles from Southern California in Vancouver, and we had a month of no sun from the smoke that came up from California. The whole of the West Coast was just covered in smoke for a month. Huge tropical storms in the Americas. And as well as Central America, obviously Mexico, the Caribbean, and the United States also got clobbered. And the same pattern is also happening in the Pacific Ocean with increased typhoons over there. And part of climate change is that there's more energy in the Earth's systems, and that energy gets absorbed by the water. And tropical storms are driven by warm water. As the air rises, it starts to spiral, and the hotter it is, the hotter the water is, the more energy, the more the air rises above it. And as it rises, it starts to spin. And then you see, depending if you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, it goes counterclockwise or clockwise, but it's the same process of these powerful storms, and they build their energy from the warmth of the water. So the warmer the water is, the bigger the storms are, the more frequent the storms are, and increasingly, I think, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, the earlier the storms are starting. And of course, the storms have a bigger impact on poor countries, but also on poor people in rich countries. New Orleans is in the richest country in the world, and the poor people of New Orleans were hammered by Katrina. And it's obviously, first of all, that poor countries have less infrastructure. Probably the buildings are more vulnerable. They may have built fewer dikes or other protections. And then afterwards, they have fewer resources to mobilize to support people in recovery. But it's also a political choice. What are the priorities of the governments? Are they spending money to suppress the people and arming up the police with super weapons, or are they protecting the people? Several other countries in Central America have appalling human rights records, and they don't really care what happens to the poor people of their country. But again, just to use the point of the United States, everybody knew Katrina was coming. Why didn't they organize trains to evacuate the poor who didn't have cars out of New Orleans in advance of the hurricane? They just left it to individuals to get out of New Orleans. There was no planning to evacuate the city. And I think that's an important point. So I want to contrast Cuba, which was hit by Hurricane Irma, with Puerto Rico, that was hit by Maria. Cuba restored power, food, etc., far, far faster than Puerto Rico. Yet Cuba is a medium-income country. Its advantage is it has a planned economy. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, is part of the richest country in the world, except that country is racist and capitalist and did nothing to help the people of Puerto Rico. So again, behind natural disasters, what we need to be clear is they are natural phenomena, natural events. What turns them into disasters is the response or lack of response of the capitalist system, which ensures that poor people are hit harder, whether it's an earthquake or a volcano. It doesn't matter what it is. Poor people are the ones who are in the pathway because they have the least protection, they have the least safeguards, and the governments generally treat them as disposable. But there's another side to that, because the capitalist class will not end climate change, but it'll be the poor and the working class that will organize to tackle climate change. And in the process of doing that, they will also tackle and get rid of capitalism.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, the situation with hurricanes, especially in the Caribbean, is outrageous. I mean, the people of Puerto Rico, which, for our viewers who are unaware, Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. So it's insane that relief wasn't given to them. They didn't have electricity in some areas for years, actually. It's absolutely crazy. But this year, particularly 2020, we've seen actually a lot of people's consumption habits go down because of the lockdowns. And we see a lot from the ruling class and the corporate media about, the way to save the planet is to not use straws and to ride your bicycle. I don't know how a working mother of 4 is supposed to schlep her kids to school on a bike, but yep, those are the types of solutions that we need to save the planet. But this year, with consumption down, Rebecca, did this have a measurable impact, enough to change the course of climate change?
So with lockdown measures, we saw one of the most dramatic drops in CO2 emissions ever recorded. In March and April, daily emissions were like 17% below the previous year, which is really significant. But fast forward a few months, in May, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was actually the highest ever recorded in human history. So yeah, CO2 emissions dramatically dropped, but as soon as lockdowns began to lift in April and May, emissions started to climb back up to pre-pandemic levels. And even that, few month dip didn't impact the overall concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? And if we look at all global greenhouse gas emissions and where they're actually coming from, and you pull out the pieces that have to do with people's individual lifestyles, you have just under 11% come from energy in residential buildings. So, turning on your lights or turning on the heat, 12% for road transport. So, you and your car or your motorcycle, 6% for livestock. So that's, the burger that you had for lunch. And combined, this is only 29%. The other 71% comes from energy use in industry, commercial buildings, agriculture, waste, etc. And we also know that just 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions since 1988, right? And so a lot of the dip that we saw under lockdowns was actually from a reduction in commercial and industrial demand for electricity, as well as a reduction in transportation. So people, not driving to work or whatever did have an impact, but also you saw, industries were shipping less, all that sort of stuff. And I mean, I personally find a tremendous amount of hope actually in the fact that basically overnight, hundreds of millions of people globally had to dramatically change literally every single aspect of our lives for the collective health of our communities and countries, right? But for a lot of people, this has meant economic disaster, as our governments have failed, to provide economic relief and prepare for the second wave that we're now in the middle of. And so, yeah, tens of millions of people in the US, for example, being unemployed meant a lot less people were commuting, which meant a lot less emissions, and that's awesome. But these families are literally now having trouble finding food or facing eviction in the dead of winter. And at the same time, of course, businesses, which are responsible for the lion's share of these emissions, have been pressuring the government to open before it's been safe, going back to business as usual, emitting huge sums of greenhouse gas emissions and putting their workers' lives at risk. And I think that this really helps us to understand this question of individual lifestyle changes, right? Yeah, we need to drive less. That really helped reduce emissions in the last few months. But outside of a pandemic, how do we do that when public transportation is inadequate and now facing huge budget cuts? Yes, we need to eat less meat, but how do we do that when we can't afford anything except for, meat-heavy fast food? And these individual lifestyle changes are not going to happen by coercion. They're not going to happen by taxation, right? We see this thing of, taxing, oil more, taxing different food products. And on their own, even if every single person switched to LED lights and started biking, which I'm a biker personally and would recommend, but even if everyone did it and became vegan and all these things, that's not going to solve the climate crisis, right? That's a really small portion of it. And individuals acting individually and making these changes, that can't change the world. Individuals acting collectively to fight for structural changes, to demand that, for example, 100% of our energy sector, which is responsible for almost 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, be produced by renewable energy, demanding a reimagining of our agricultural sector. That is how we can tackle the climate crisis. And as part of these structural changes, I so believe wholeheartedly that people can and will change their individual habits, and that will be healthier for all of us and our planet, and it will be part of this collective fight for, the future of this world. But we can't blame and hold individuals accountable while the real culprits continue to really ravage the planet.
So yeah, this has been an excellent discussion. We couldn't have had an end of the year episode without talking about the climate. It's like the overarching, problem of our time. But Bill, I was wondering if you could just kind of end with us here today about talking about where you see the climate movement needing to go in the upcoming year.
I think just to frame that a little bit, I think we need to reflect on the complete failure of capitalism to deal with COVID. I mean, COVID, when you want to get down to it, dealing with it is really simple. It's you test people, you trace everybody, if they have COVID, you provide isolation, and you have protective equipment. That's dead simple. And most of the capitalist countries in the world have failed utterly and miserably. And you, Rebecca, and Toya are in a country where they failed criminally. Yara and I are just in countries where they're fucking incompetent. Sorry about that. And there is no way that if they can't deal with climate change, if they can't deal with COVID, they're going to deal with climate change. And I think we have to remember that they're still building more pipelines. And then there's all the other eco disasters, which we haven't even talked about plastic, collapsing biodiversity, and all those other factors of capitalism. I think one of the things, the movement will come back, there's no question about it. But what I think I want to focus on is, what do we as Socialist Alternative Internationally do? And I think central to our program, and this might seem contradictory to what we're talking about, a lifestyle, but central to our program is jobs. Big business and government always present it as an either or. You can have jobs or the environment. And unfortunately, some unions and environmentalists buy this poison snake oil lie. Because what capitalism cannot provide good jobs, and it cannot deal with climate change. And when they talk about that choice, what they're talking about is their profits or our climate. There are millions of rewarding jobs waiting to be done, of energy conversion, of upgrading buildings, and building and providing public transit, ecological reconstruction. Overwhelmingly, workers would rather have a well-paid union job protecting the environment rather than destroying the environment. But that offer is not given to them by the capitalist class. And I think key to what we do is raising the idea of a good jobs program to rebuild the environment, Now that has one minor qualification, is that we have to take the resources of society into the hands of humanity and not have it controlled by the ultra-rich. Which gets us back to the same thing. We have to free society from the death cell that is capitalism and build a socialist alternative. And I'll leave it to Rebecca just to wrap us up.
So much, Bill. I think the points that you're making are really, really important, and the incompetence of the capitalist class to deal with any crisis that hits the working class the hardest, which is most crises, it's staggering, really. And I think when we see kind of, I guess, what is sometimes seen as the glimmer of hope of, you know, Trump leaving, Biden coming in, maybe the Paris Climate Accord is being reintroduced, etc. I think it's still so important that we highlight the fact that under capitalism, we're not going to solve this problem, because there's no way that capitalism can solve this problem. So I think the question about 2021 is incredibly important. And I do really want to hear from Rebecca as well about this. Like, what do you think that is going to happen in 2021? What do you think should happen? Do you think it's going to happen?
Totally. I mean, I think what you're raising there at the end about Biden and the Paris Climate Agreement is really interesting, right? Like, Trump has been a huge threat to the climate, absolutely. And it's a victory for so many reasons that he's gone. But I mean, you know, and it's very likely that Joe Biden will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. But even if every single country in that agreement met their emissions target, which the vast majority of them are not, will not, have not, even then, we're literally not going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius warming, which is what all the scientists say we need to stay below. And so I think that this is just you know, one of many examples of the fact that we need to go so far beyond that. And you know, we cannot keep collaborating with, relying on, waiting on any elected official or any political party that takes money from these industries, from the fossil fuel industry, from the big agricultural industries, from any of these industries that have you know, profits to make from continuing the devastation of the environment, right? How can you serve ExxonMobil, who's funding your campaign, and a young American woman who doesn't know if I'll live into my 50s because of the existential threat of climate change, right? You can't serve both. And so we need to get organized ourselves. And I think, you know, Yara, you were raising earlier about these inspiring youth-led climate movements that have broken out. And I think absolutely it's just a question of when they come back onto the scene again. You know, and I think that that's what we're going to need, right? Young people have to keep hitting the streets week after week, month after month. And we also need to link up with the working class, right? We need to link up with the workers in these polluting industries, with construction workers, with transportation workers, the people who we will need to expand our public transportation infrastructure, to, you know, retrofit all of our homes and buildings to be green and sustainable, to reforest our planet, do all of these things that we are capable of doing, that we have the people to do, right? But you know, it'll take linking up these movements, because, you know, it's only the united movement of workers and youth that can actually bring society to a grinding halt, right? And then rebuild it again on a sustainable socialist basis.
Thanks so much, Rebecca and Bill. This has been a great conversation about how we can't just defensively protect the environment. We have to be offensive as well. And what that means is job programs and innovation, something that capitalism cannot and will not give us. So thanks again for coming on our show today, and hopefully we'll see you back again in 2021. So we're continuing on with our two-part special here. And we have Per Ake, who is from Sweden, and we have Sonja, who is from Austria, here with us during this segment. So I want to start just by, you know, reiterating the fact that 2019 was a year of mass movements, and we've discussed a little bit of this. You know, and 2020 kind of started on a continuation of that pattern, but then, of course, the overwhelming theme of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one would think that with all of the lockdowns that we had across the world, even though many of them came far too late and here in the US are still not happening, you know, you would think that it would cut across these mass movements, but actually the opposite happened. You know, for example, in Hong Kong at the beginning of the year, and we saw this continuation as we've been speaking about. But Per Ake, I want to start with you. Can you remind us of what was happening before the pandemic in terms of mass movements? Because we talked a little bit about the economy, but specifically in regards to mass movements, what was happening?
Well, it feels like a very long time ago. I mean, but 2019, we should remember as a year of mass revolts. It was a culmination of the decade from the Great Recession, 2008 and 9, that there were these revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. There were the Occupy movement of squares different around the globe. And then it was also general strikes, particularly in Southern Europe. And all of that led to those struggles, they worsened. Capitalist governments took measures to save the system, and they created parasitic monsters, billionaires like Jeff Bezos, with more money than billions of people. On the other hand, they strangled the healthcare sector we've seen now. There were new record levels of refugees that were forced to leave their countries or their homes, and young people didn't get a real job or housing. And this exploded in 2019. There were mass protests and revolts that started for different reasons. Sometimes it was price of ticket price on collective transport. It was abolished subsidies on food or petrol. It was repression from the state or fraud elections. But the common thing were many. They lasted longer, and they rapidly focused on demanding that the government should resign or be overthrown, and demands for real changes in society. And it was also to a high degree led by youth and women. And they were international. They spread from Ecuador to Chile, from Lebanon to Iraq and Iran. And there were also similarities with the women's movement that have been for the last decade, and then with the youth climate strikes. They were international. Decade-old regimes were overthrown, with like al-Bashir in Sudan, Bouteflika in Algeria. Governments were overthrown or had to resign in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Chile. And there was a common slogan saying that all politicians should go. We don't want any one of them. And of course, the International Socialist Alternative, we recognized, we welcomed these movements. We saw them as very positive. They showed the real relationship of forces between the working class and the capitalist class. What is called the 1% versus 9%, to show that the 1% was much less than 1%. And it gave confidence to workers and youth everywhere. At the same time, we also warned against the weaknesses. There was lack of democratic organizing. There was no clear socialist revolutionary program that could achieve the system change people wanted. We also warned against repression, particularly in Hong Kong. We said the Chinese regime can attack Hong Kong, but also other measures. They want to stop struggle. The ruling class want to stop struggle by offering negotiations, offering power sharing, offering new elections. And then, of course, the movements can't go on forever. They get tired if they don't get any results. Recent examples of diverting struggle is from August this year in Mali, where the military in a coup took power after a mass movement going on for months. And they promised to fulfill the demands of the mass movement. Of course, they have not. And now there is a new conflict between the military and the mass organizations. And in Ethiopia, where the Abiy Ahmed regime used repression, increased ethnic violence, encouraging that, and now a civil war to block movements. So what happened in 2019 continued in the beginning of the year in January and February until the pandemic hit and then resurfaced.
Thanks so much, Per Ake. So I want to go quickly to Sonja. Per Ake mentioned a little bit about the movements that built up to the year 2020. But what was the impact initially, of the pandemic on these mass movements?
I think the first reaction, and that's quite natural, was a shock. There was a shock and a stop also of the movements. And also there was a strengthening of the governments This idea of we are all in this together, it's new for all of us. They tried to do their best to somehow handle the crisis. I think this was a feeling at the beginning. But then it became quite quickly clear that we are not all in this together. And it was actually in some countries, it was even the pressure from below that only led to lockdown measures, because working class people were demanding security, which the governments at the beginning, not all of them were prepared to give. And then it became much more and more clear how different layers in society, the working class, different to the rich, are affected by this. For example, the comrades in Ireland, the Socialist Party in Ireland, they expose the ignorance of the ruling elites towards the needs of working class people with initiating Workers Speak Out. And also later in the year, they helped to win the battle of workers in Ireland, in the Queen's University Students' Union workers, to fight for their rights. In some countries, especially in the neo-colonial countries, it was a choice, or I mean, what you call a choice, of ordinary people to decide if they fetch the virus or if they have nothing to eat. So everywhere, it became clearer and clearer, of course, that the health systems were completely overstretched, that they can't cope with the situation, which of course was the effect also of decades of cuts in this sector. Remember the pictures we have seen from Italy, where the military was transporting the coffins of all the COVID deaths. So then there was this question of how did it come to all this? And we saw this development of all these very weird conspiracy theories. And I think it's very important to make absolutely clear that there was no conscious attempt to spread the virus by whatever ruling elite clique or whatever. I mean, just if you look at the economic crisis that was triggered by Corona, then it's very obvious that the ruling class has no interest in this pandemic. But the other side is, whatever happens in society and in economy, the ruling class will always try to use what's happening for their benefits and for their profits. So, of course, they try to use the situation to attack the rights of working class people. That's what they did all over the world. And comrades have been taking up these. For example, in Russia, where our members there initiated the so-called virus union. Because another problem is that the trade unions in many situations didn't really take up the situation, but were even more shocked and were actually closing ranks with the ruling class. Of course, the ruling class also tried to use increased repression against the working class. I mean, this is obvious that, as I said, they try to use every opportunity they have. But in overall, I think they were not very successful with this. They did not get very far with their attempts, because it's clear that the trust in their rotten capitalist system is obviously decreasing. The support for the governments is fading away. And on the other side, the self-confidence of especially female workers in health, in education, in retail has increased enormously, because it became so clear who is really running society. And it's not the bosses, it's not the bankers, it's not the rich elite, but it's ordinary working class people. So yes, there was a lull for some weeks, and then there was a new wave of protests. And this was never stopped by the virus since. And some, it's actually impossible. I had a branch meeting yesterday evening, and we tried to have like every comrade gives an example of a protest that happened this year, to see that it was not only a horrible year, but it was always also a year of protest. And there were quite a lot of comrades there, but were not enough comrades there to deal with all the different protests that happened during this year against Corona, but also against a lot of other things, racism, repression, and all this. So no, it didn't stop the protests all over the world.
I think this is really interesting and really good. I love how kind of like the meetings that we have in our organization are always kind of a place for anecdotes all the time about how we kind of perceive what's happening. And I think you're really, like, it's really true. There's been so many movements and so much developed in the last year or so. And that's obviously why we're having this two-part extravaganza episode, because there's so much we didn't know what to do, how to close the year. But I wanted to ask you specifically, because like you said, there was a little bit of kind of like the movements started going down and then up again and then down and up again. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how this struggle emerged from lockdown and how we got to a point where there's so much struggle constantly.
I think the killing of George Floyd was a turning point, and the anger, first in the US, exploded right in the middle of the face of the ruling class. And it was, of course, at the beginning, it was primarily the anger against the deadly racism in the US. But it was, and it still is, much, much more also the anger about the social injustice. The fact that the life expectancy with Corona is very much depending on your income, on the access you have to the health sector. And therefore, of course, it is also linked to the color of your skin. So it was an explosion, not only in the US, it was an international explosion. In Vienna, 50,000 marched on June the 4th against racism and police repression. And only 2 days later, tens of thousands in Berlin and in Munich, in Germany. It was all over the world. And these protests actually never ended. The killing hasn't ended, and the protests haven't ended. And they also triggered the mass protests in Nigeria, which took the Black Lives Matter movement as an example, as an inspiration. And it showed that it's possible, although there is a pandemic, although there is repression, to fight back. I think in many countries, and again in Austria, for example, but also in France, it's often linked to protests of poor working class youth from a migrant background, because they are especially targeted by the racist lockdown measures. It's so obvious that the ruling elites, of course, to protect themselves, put a lot of extra money, not only in the economy, but also in what they understand as security, which means weapons, police, repression. And on the other hand, they don't put any money in social security, in the health sector, to make it possible to have smaller classes. And also, 90,000 children, while I'm speaking, 90,000 children alone in London live in what the ruling class calls temporary accommodation, which means they are homeless. And at this moment in the US, but also in Scotland, there are new records of drugs deaths. And this is just one of the dramatic effects of the economic catastrophe that is developing. So this, in addition to the completely overstretched health sector, shows day by day the complete incapability of capitalism to give something like a future or a safety or a decent life. And therefore, I think especially the protests in the health sector are so important, and are something we really should not only follow, but we really have to engage. And we do not only have to be part, we are part of it. It's all over the world. It's not only in the advanced capitalist countries where nurses, doctors, health workers are struggling. It's in Chile, it's in India, it's in Kenya, in South Africa, Zimbabwe, in Liberia. All there are strikes of health workers. And at best, the ruling class is ignoring it. But in a lot of cases, like in Russia or in Egypt, for example, the governments make extra attacks on those health workers who come out public to tell about the truth of a non-functioning, dangerous situation in the health sector. And on top of all of this, we have a new generation, a youth that has never experienced capitalism as something working, functioning. But we're coming out of one crisis, which wasn't really overcome, and we're going directly into the next crisis. So there is no bright future. There is no light at the end of the tunnel in this system. They see this, I mean, the new normal is not a new normal, it's the true normal of capitalism. That is what capitalism is like. That's what it is always, with very few exceptions. So, youth is seeing that it's linked internationally, and they fight back. They see that it's necessary to fight back, and they actually really do it.
Thanks so much, Sonja. So I want to go back a little bit to something you mentioned earlier, Per Ake, which was, the movements that we saw in 2019. Over this past year, several of those movements and revolts, et cetera, have reemerged, starting with Lebanon. And also we saw a continuation of the struggle in Chile with the referendum victory, which was, a huge success and extremely inspiring to people all over the world. In Bolivia, which we've spoken about a lot on our show, there was a movement against the coup that won a victory. Sonja just mentioned Nigeria, but we also saw Thailand, Indonesia, Guatemala, Peru. It goes on. And Sonja was mentioning the healthcare workers, but also education workers. So can you talk a little bit about some of those struggles that we saw previously that have continued on through this crazy year of 2020?
We could say that 2019 created a new type of struggles, and that wave arrived in new countries this year. And also, as you mentioned, many of them have been themes here in Word to Win, very good episodes. And Bolivia, I think, is maybe the most important sequel this year, as you mentioned. I mean, last year's coup had the support of the military, of the capitalists, the reactionary wing in Bolivia, but also of imperialism. Sweden's social democratic foreign minister said it was good someone acted against fraud elections of Evo Morales and supported the coup. And these coup makers, they were humiliated and defeated in the elections a year later. That again show these movements coming back and the real strength between the forces. If you look at new countries, maybe the most spectacular is in Belarus. That Lukashenko's regime is still hanging on a thread, even though it's a bit more on safe ground for a very temporary period. It was election fraud that ignited demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people, not just in Minsk, but all over the country, with youth, pensioners, workers, and for the first time in the country's history, LGBT people at the front of the struggle. And there were discussions about the end of strike. And Lukashenko, he responded with really brutal repression, as he used to do. But when he went to a factory where he was claiming that he had support, he was booed by the workers. And the workers showed that they'd not voted for him, that he had not got their support. And the problem, of course, again, is lack of democratic organization of the struggle and a clear program. And then Lukashenko could say, well, I have the support of Putin. The Russian military will intervene to support me. And that also held back the movement a bit. But it's also important to remember that this is in Europe. I mean, from Stockholm, it's Minsk is as close as the northern region in Sweden where we have consulars. And in Eastern and Central Europe, there has been more struggle. It's a region with struggle this autumn. And since July, there has been big protests against corruption in Bulgaria. And then, of course, there was this mass movement again in Poland, led by young women, against the new proposal of total ban of abortion, right of abortion. And we also seen in Russia, in Eastern Siberia, where in the city of Khabarovsk, there has been demonstrations regularly since July, and in other countries as well in that region. New also, as you mentioned, is the movement of young people in Thailand. It was triggered in February when opposition party was banned. And it was mainly students in the beginning, but it developed onto the streets, also with 100,000 or more in the biggest demonstrations. They demand the resignation of the prime minister, which is the same General Prayut that organized the military coup in 2014. And also, they are criticizing the king. The king, you know, he lives in Germany and he's super rich and he has his own military wing. But Thailand has the most repressive laws of any country against criticism of the monarchy. But so far, repression and introducing state of emergency and so on has failed to stop this movement. And it's had an effect in society, although it's been hard to get the general population of broader layers of workers to participate in it. But it has been even reflected in media and so on. But it has also some of the weaknesses. It tried to copy the movement in Hong Kong. And the positive side, of course, is the audacity and some new methods, but it's also priding itself with having no formal organizing or leaders. And that was also the case with the explosive movement in Nigeria, which our comrades have really intervened in and also analyzed, and there are new material coming from the Nigerian comrades on what happened. It was 2 weeks after the general strike was called off by the semi or fully corrupt union leaders, and youth took on the streets against police violence. And the regime of President Buhari, he tried to block this movement by saying, well, we're going to dissolve this hated police force called SARS. But the movement didn't stop. And it's similar to Black Lives Matter and other movements. The anger became directed against the president, the regime, and the extreme social crisis in this country. More than half the working population is unemployed or underemployed, and those who have a job might not get their wages at all, or this extremely low wages. And this is, I mean, we've seen so many other movements. It was mentioned that the president in Peru was overthrown. The Guatemalan government has to retreat from proposed cuts. And then, of course, we have the incredible mass movement in India, which was in last week's episode of Word to Win.
I think this is so interesting and so good to hear both from Per Ake and from Sonja as well about those movements, because I think there's been so many of them, and I think that's also been kind of like a trend throughout these two episodes that we were talking about. I think it always goes back to that. So I'm particularly interested to hear from the both of you what you think is going to happen next year. Do you think this trend is going to continue? What do you think 2021 has in store for us, Per Ake?
Okay, in 2021, I mean, Biden instead of Trump will be a disappointment for anyone believing that there will be some kind of return to normal. Of course, Trump will be out, and that's big, and that's very good. But there will be increasingly consciousness that we have entered a new era, and also a new role of US imperialism in its conflicts, particularly with Chinese imperialism. From the top of society, we will see the continuation of this trend of nationalism, protectionism in the economic field, and even if it's not like a straight line, and they will not maybe always confess that that's what they're doing. About coming struggles, we will see this explosive situation in the health sector, which Sonja described, that will create movements and protests in many countries. And it's a fact that there are few governments that are stable in the 2020s, and that will continue. The climate crisis will be high on the agenda again, with new movements. It will come back stronger than it was before. And the increasing criticism of the capitalist system. It has to be a change of system, of society. And it's not that it's going to be super easy for socialists, but the struggles of the 2020s have only begun, and they will assist enormously in recreating both a bigger workers' movement and the revolutionary forces needed to abolish capitalism.
Thanks, Per Ake. That's very inspirational and giving us hope for, a good terrain to fight for a better world. Sonja, where do you see the movement going in 2021? And also, what do you say to the workers and youth that are watching our show today?
Well, everybody was hoping that 2020 wouldn't repeat itself. And I think it's very clear that neither the pandemic, nor the climate crisis, nor the economic crisis is over. But we also see this year already that none of these can stop people from standing up and fighting for their rights. And I think that the ruling class is actually quite afraid of what is happening. I don't think we can exactly say where or when or even around which topic the protests will explode, but we can say that they are going to explode. This is very, very clear. So what we can say is that when there will be these explosions, we need to prepare, and we start to prepare now. Next year is also the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune. We have a song in Austria by a left group which says, why didn't we march onto Versailles in the Paris Commune? And what it means is that we must not stop if the ruling class gives us the one or the other small concession. We do not only want to have the piece of the cake, and we also not satisfied with the cake. We want the full bakery. We want to decide and to run, and we need to run the society and the economy. And to gain that, we need to build the forces of revolutionary socialism worldwide. So what I want to say to all of you watching these is make yourself the best Christmas present, make yourself the best New Year's resolution. Join into our struggle, join into the struggle for a socialist society, and join into the international socialist alternative.
I think that is, I couldn't say it better myself. This is, I think, the lesson that we keep repeating, but I think it can't be stressed enough. That is what we need to be doing in 2021. This year has been difficult for everyone, but it's also moved us forward so much in terms of consciousness, in terms of the social struggles. And we have to use that. We have to use this momentum, and we can only do it when we're organized and when we're united. And that is what the International Socialist Alternative is doing. So thank you so much, Sonja, and thank you so much, Per Ake. I saw that you had to go and tend to your dogs, but I'm really sad that we couldn't see them today, because I always like the little pet breaks that we do. But it was really great to see you, and to see you, Sonja, as well, and hear this really fascinating analysis of 2020. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
So as well as all of the other crises that happened in 2020, we've also seen this year as like a year of massive political crisis. So I think that's the case of basically every country around the world right now. And it's also every shade of the political establishment. Every capitalist party has been in crisis, from the right populists like Trump and Bolsonaro to the old mainstreams of conservatives like Merkel in Germany, also, you know, the Social Democrats and Pedro Sanchez in Spain. And we've covered a lot of this during the year, so we don't want to bore you. But of course, as a socialist show, World to Win is most interested in the left and the struggles to change society. And I think that is very important to talk about, because we have had so many this year. And, you know, it's been incredible. So we have two speakers here today with us. We've got Becci, who's from our section in England, Wales, and Scotland. Hi, Becci. And we also have Brian from the US.
Hey.
Hey. And I think these are specifically two countries that were at the forefront of this. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting to talk about this. So I wanted to ask the first question, that's quite a big one, and I want to, hear first from Becci about it. So can you tell us a little bit about how the left was doing at the start of the year? I know it's been a really long year, really long time, but if we can just get a little, you know, reminder of what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a long year, hasn't it? But I mean, in Britain, at the start of the year, we were in the middle of the leadership election for the Labour Party. And trying to deal with the fact that Jeremy Corbyn and the official left leadership had kind of stepped aside from taking a lead in that election, and we eventually obviously saw Keir Starmer win. But also, one thing I was thinking about earlier is that we had the general election in Ireland at the beginning of the year, where we saw Mick Barry, our TD, ISA TD, re-elected, but also there was like a surge to the Green Party and Sinn Féin and historical low votes for the establishment parties as well. And also in countries like Spain, we saw Podemos go into coalition with PSOE, the Social Democracy Party. And that was, kind of welcomed by a lot of people because you saw the reversal of attacks on trade unions, an increase in the minimum wage, job creation plans and things like that. That was obviously all of the plans before the pandemic hit. But it was kind of they went into coalition on the basis of agreeing to commit into fiscal discipline. And we kind of raised at the time that they could have won more on the streets by mobilizing movements and things like that. But that's just kind of like a little flavor of where things were at the start of the year. But obviously a lot has changed since then.
Yeah, I think so much has happened and all around the world. So I want to ask Brian as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happened in the US and the region?
Yeah, so at the beginning of 2020, there were huge hopes in the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was mobilizing people around slogans like "We need a political revolution against the billionaire class." And this time around, even more left-wing than 2016, billionaires shouldn't exist. And there was huge energy around this, but a lot of it was based around the false hope that the left, that the working class could use the Democratic Party to change things. And I think a lot of people have learned through that experience, which we can get into later. Also, the beginning of 2020 is obviously coming out of what we forget was a historic year of struggle in 2019. Because of all we've been through this year, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that, Lebanon, Chile, Hong Kong, Sudan, Algeria, etc., just country after country, insurrection and general strike. And here in the US, what we came out of in 2019 was the election victory of Kshama Sawant at the end of the year against the richest man in the world, the most expensive city council election in the history of Seattle, with the ruling class spending and the right wing spending more than ever before. And we again face that battle this year.
Yeah, so a lot has been going on this year. Obviously, we've had so many episodes talking about the ups and the downs and everything that's been going on. But Becky, could you talk a little bit about the effect that the pandemic has had on the movements?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic, like you say, has had such an impact on everything, politically and in our personal lives and everything like that. But I think you can see with the kind of left parties how the pandemic has kind of sped up all of the different processes which were happening already. Like, for example, in Britain with Keir Starmer, when he was first elected leader in April, we kind of weren't sure how quickly people were going to see what he was really about. But I think that, if it had been kind of a more normal year, he might have had a longer honeymoon period. But actually, he didn't really have any honeymoon period at all, because straight away he was forced to decide which side he was going to be on, whether he was going to support what the government was doing and their mishandling of the crisis, or if he was going to squarely side with the working class. And he chose the former. He chose to not be critical of the government. And actually, one of the first things that he said when he got elected leader was to say that we shouldn't criticize the government for the sake of it, as if the left just criticize for the sake of it and not because they actually disagree with what they're doing. So I think it kind of exposed what he was really about quite quickly. And then that meant that he had to follow that even quicker with a purge of the left, which we didn't think would have happened as quickly as it did. But the pandemic kind of put that pressure. So it even ended up with Jeremy Corbyn being suspended from the Labour Party, and thousands of people have left the Labour Party over the last few months. But this is like at the same time that in the opinion polls, you're seeing the biggest drops for the Tory party and Johnson as an individual. But, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party aren't really gaining from that. They're not winning support. And so this kind of false strategy that unfortunately a lot on the left have, that, you know, this is like a time for national unity, that we all need to come together, and we shouldn't be critical of the government, and we shouldn't put politics into dealing with the pandemic, is, you know, it's a completely wrong idea, because we can see the reason that the government, like right-wing governments, have mishandled this is because they're putting profit and business interest first, because they've underfunded health services and things like that, because people are already low paid and have been losing their jobs. So like political questions have been at the forefront of dealing with the pandemic, and the fact that former left organizations like the Labour Party haven't challenged what the government are doing is actually sped up this whole process of people drawing the conclusion that the Labour Party isn't a party that's going to be beneficial to us, and maybe we need to look at building a new party. But I would just say as well that despite that happening, that hasn't stopped struggle from taking place. Like, we've seen strikes, we've seen protests, we've seen big movements taking place around the world, even without, you know, a left party or a workers' party being there to help to lead those struggles.
So Brian, it's not just the UK that has been going through these questions of, you know, left-wing politicians and the question of a new party. Here in the US, we of course had Bernie Sanders. And although, you know, now at the end of the year, we can look back and kind of say, you know, what happened. I think it's important for us to analyze the whole process that you know, we went through this past year in regards to the DNC and Bernie himself. So when did it start to go wrong for Bernie, in your opinion?
There have always been limitations with Bernie Sanders politics, but I want to pinpoint something 5 years ago. The mass climate march in New York, there was a forum with Naomi Klein, Bernie Sanders, Bill McKibben, and Kshama Sawant, lots of big names in the movement. And at that time, there were rumors about Bernie running, and Kshama put to him that Bernie should run for president as an independent to build a new party of the working class.
I would appeal to Bernie to run as an independent candidate for president in 2016, not tied to the Democrats and their big business agenda.
Given the nature of where we are today as a nation, can we in fact put together an effective grassroots third-party movement in America? And it's and the answer is maybe.
We would be in a much different situation right now if Bernie had taken that advice. First of all, he could have won in 2016 in a three-way race against Trump and Hillary Clinton. Even if he didn't win, though, and Trump did get in office, the working class, oppressed people would have had a tool to fight back against Trumpism. Instead of this nerdy Democratic Party stuff of Russiagate and all this stuff that nobody cared about, we would have had a party that could have fought on the issues facing working class and oppressed people. So I think we can look back to that, but also there were still opportunities this year with Bernie Sanders, and he didn't fight the Democratic Party leadership hard enough. This is the logic of leftists participating in the Democratic Party, is holding back what they're doing in order to appease the party leadership, which unfortunately AOC is doing a bit right now in how she deals with Pelosi. So I think we can learn from those mistakes, but also see there's going to be a big opportunity in the coming months and years, in that the Democratic Party can't hide behind saying they're a party of opposition against the Republicans. The Biden White House is going to need to appear to deliver. And in this period of capitalism, they will not be able to deliver for working class people. So socialist alternative in this context, we need to provoke debate in the labor movement, in movements like Black Lives Matter, in the socialist left, about the need for a new working class party, because it's objectively necessary. And if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, the far right forces will grow and occupy that vacuum that will exist as huge anger at the Democratic Party develops.
Yeah, I think these are really, really good points. And I was like, kind of, you know, we were talking about this and it all sounds pretty gloomy and kind of like all the things that should have happened and haven't happened, or things that we want to happen but aren't happening. So I wanted to ask you, Brian, do Do you think there's any good news? Anything that happened with the left in 2020 that was good and that was something that we kind of like need to emphasize and we can celebrate?
I think if we look at Latin America right now, there are huge, inspiring struggles and even victories. Not necessarily the working class coming to power or the beginning of socialist transformation of society, but we should celebrate, along with millions of other people, the fact that the coup in Bolivia was eventually defeated. It could have been defeated with mass mobilization from the start, but the limitations of Morales and Mas's politics didn't call people out on the street to stop the coup. But the masses, even without being given a clear leadership, were continuously fighting against the right-wing coup, and eventually this resulted in the MAS coming back to power, which, despite their limitations, is still a victory of the movement. Also, recently in Latin America and Brazil, PSOL, the left party to the left of Lula's PT, did very well in elections, getting to the second round for mayor in Sao Paulo, and also winning the mayoral position in a city in the north of the country. So I think those are things we can look to. Also, in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, was a huge inspiration across the world. There's not a ton of tangible victories that you can point to, but one really important one that wouldn't have happened without the Black Lives Matter uprising was the Amazon tax in Seattle. At a time when the billionaires are hoarding and pillaging and taking away the wealth of the working class on a daily basis, we took some of that wealth back through movement to tax the super rich, tax the corporations and billionaires to provide social housing for working class people. And that wouldn't have been done without the strength of Socialist Alternative and Kshama Sawant in Seattle. And that shows the importance of that seat, that the biggest victory of the Black Lives Matter movement across the country was won in Seattle, is no mistake. And that seat is now under attack from a recall campaign against Kshama. And I'd urge people to check out the rally we're going to have on January 9th. Not just for folks in Seattle, not just for folks in the US, but internationally, because of how much this seat for a revolutionary socialist, for a Marxist, matters for winning victories for the working class.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely going to be tuning into that. And I think it's also a really important connection to make, that, those movements on the ground connect to other movements as well, and kind of put forward ideas that can actually win victories for other campaigns. So I think that's really important. And you talked a little bit about kind of the role of Socialist Alternative in all of this. And I think this is another really important topic to discuss. So I wanted to ask Becci, what about the International Socialist Alternative? Was this a good year for us? How do we kind of fit within the broader left? How did we do that in the last year?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it was definitely an interesting year. And ISA, as a kind of Marxist revolutionary party, I think ultimately we will look at 2020 as being a turning point in history, that the pandemic and internationally the government's mishandlings of them have had a huge impact on the outlook of millions of working class people around the world. And it's also exposed how capitalism as a system is completely incapable of dealing not just with big things like this COVID pandemic, but even, providing the most basic things to humanity. And so, in terms of how we fit into all of this, we will support and have supported in the last year any attempts to build broad left movements and parties. So Brian mentioned PSOL in Brazil, that ISA in Brazil has been involved in some of the election campaigns there, and will actively build any genuine attempts to build a new party, a left party for the working class. But I think the important thing is, as we've discussed here, there are inherent weaknesses within the ideas of reformism and the approach of some of the figures like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, and particularly in a situation of crisis like we've had this year. So within these parties and movements, will argue for the need for socialist policies, but also socialist methods and working class methods of fighting for those policies. So mass movements, strike action, protests and things like that as the only way that we can achieve change. And so to be able to do that, we need to continue to build a strong Marxist organization like ISA. And we have grown in the last year in many countries in the world, but particularly countries like Britain and the US, where some of these questions have been to the fore. But also we've been present in protests and different things that have been happening in every country where we have a section. So in Nigeria, in Poland, now in Belarus, in assisting to build these movements as well and trying to offer a contribution on the best way forward for these movements as well.
Yeah, Becky just mentioned the fact that we've been growing as an organization internationally. And so if you're watching this this broadcast and you too want to be involved in the exciting work that we've been doing on every continent on this globe, please check out our website. The link is below, and you can join us. If we don't have a section in your country, you can start a section in your country, because it's so important that we unite the international struggle against capitalism. But before we head out, I just want to hear from both of our guests. What do you think that the left needs to do in 2021? You know, Yara talked about how this past year, it's almost demoralizing in the sense that we've been in our houses during this pandemic, but at the same time, we're seeing all of this struggle happen, the question of a new party, people questioning capitalism as a system. So Becky, you first, what do you see the left needs to do in the coming year?
Well, I think that there will be a continuation of that struggle next year and a continuation of the searching for a political alternative internationally. And I think that those working class and young people that are involved in struggle will be discussing, will be thinking, will be looking for an alternative. And if the existing left formations or individuals are going to play any useful role in that, then they will need to be involved in those struggles. And I think if they're not involved or they don't give them a lead, then there will be attempts to build new formations and new individuals will come to the fore. And that, you know, obviously isn't without complications and false starts, but I think it's completely necessary that we set that as a task next year.
Giving us some hope, Becky, thanks, because we need it. What about you, Brian? What do you think the left needs in the coming year?
Yeah, so we've seen all these mass struggles across the world. But like, for instance, with the Black Lives Matter uprising in the US, biggest protest in the history of this country. But what type of organizations? I live in Minneapolis. New organizations have not been thrown up in my neighborhood for people to participate even just on Zoom with each other. Yet when there was a protest in my neighborhood, everyone was out on the streets, right? So we need to get organized for an ongoing fight. And Hong Kong is a negative example of this, in that we had a huge movement in Hong Kong, a historic movement that lasted for months, for years, heroic actions being taken place. But what was the organizational principle that was put forward? Was be like water and don't get organized. I mean, yeah, Bruce Lee's super cool when you're a teenager, but what does it mean for working class struggle to say be like water and don't get organized? We need to get organized. And then what ideas do we get organized around? We need fundamental change. You can see it with the pandemic. Who's essential in this crisis? It's working class people who are essential. The billionaires, we don't need them, but we need to fight against them and get organized for fundamental change. So I'd say get organized and around clear ideas and around the power and potential power of working class and oppressed people. And that's what Toya said with ISA, because we're awesome.
We're definitely awesome. And I think these were all like really, really interesting and important points. And I think finishing this broadcast for this year with this note of not only reviewing what happened for the left in the previous year, but also saying, okay, we've seen all these movements, but now we need to organize. And the way to organize is to join the ASA. There's no better way to end the year. So thank you, Becky, and thank you, Brian, for being here with us and kind of sharing this information with us and the analysis. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, guys. So now we're doing a special end of the year segment where we're going to shout out our top 5 biggest fans of World to Win. So this is in no particular order, just our top 5. But the first person that I want to mention is Robin Amara, who is from the US. She's in Boston. She is an essential worker at Whole Foods and has organized grocery store workers and watches us every week. So we want to thank Robin for watching us. Next, I want to shout out one of our viewers from England who always has such great questions for us on the show, and that's PD Hunt. So I want to thank you, PD, for sending us all these great questions for us to answer and for our panelists as well.
I love this. I love this little segment. I think it's so great. And it's so great to see that we have these like consistent viewers as well. And there's someone on this list that I think we should thank for getting us those kind of consistent viewers, and that's Fionn from Ireland, who is one of the people running the Twitter account for the Socialist Party in Ireland, which is in the International Socialist Alternative there. And he's been doing an amazing job of getting the word out there, getting us new viewers. So it's really good to see that as well. And another person that I really want to highlight is Nick Jones from the US. And Nick is based in Seattle, and he's really instrumental in the Sharma campaign that we're doing there. So it's really good to see the engagement coming from, you know, the ground, the people who are fighting the fights that we're talking about here as well. And I think that is something that's always nice to look at the comments, see what people are saying about actually doing those things. And that leads me to the last of our list, who is Vilgot from Sweden. And we've seen him be such a great advocate on social media, both on our Facebook and our YouTube channel. It's always great to see the comments, and it's so great to have such amazing people who are watching us regularly.
Yeah, special shout out to this 5, but also to all of our viewers. Thank you for engaging with our show this year as we launched in 2020 in this crazy time. And so we're excited for you to participate in our shows in the coming year. So thanks to everyone. And now we're going to go to our shout out of the week. This is a special shout out, you know, from the hearts of me and Yara to the team of people.
Don't embarrass them.
The team of people who deal with us every week, put on this show, all the tech that goes into it. I have no idea what it takes to put these things onto the internets. I really don't understand the process. I plug my mic in. And so I want to shout out some of them, you know, whether it be Dara, Mike, Fabian, Danny, Grayson, and Andrew, who take the time, you know, every single weekend, staying up late, helping us find guests, all of that. There's so much that goes into this. So we want to thank you for everything that you do for World to Win.
And it's so much that's being done behind the scenes. And remember, we are an international organization. We're talking about a variety of different time zones, still trying to make this work. So it's so great to be with a team of such competent people who are doing so much to get us out there. So thank you everyone for being here this week and last week as well. This is going to be our last episode of the year, but we're going to be back next year with some more World to Win. So make sure to follow us both here to subscribe to us both here on YouTube, but also on Facebook and Instagram. So you will get notified when we go live next, and that you can keep in touch with us. And I know we've said it so many times in the last 2 weeks, but it's really so important. If you liked what you've heard today, don't just subscribe, don't just click the bell. Do that, but don't just do that. Contact us, get in touch. We'll probably have someone in your region, and even if we don't, you can set one up. And it's so important that we have this international organization that will move us forward in 2021 and the future. So thank you everyone for watching, and see you soon.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
we fight, when we fight, when we fight, solidarity.